30-year mortgages are out of reach, auto loans carry punishing monthly payments, and comprehensive student loan relief remains entirely paralyzed. When politicians try to explain why it costs so much to build a life, they point fingers at corporate greed, partisan gridlock, or restrictive local zoning laws. Those factors exist, but they ignore the massive structural force operating beneath all of them. It is the roughly $40 trillion federal debt. We often hear the national debt described as a vague warning for future generations. That is false. It is an active mechanism operating right now. The debt is actively restructuring the American social contract. It drives a K-shaped economy where wage earners fall further behind, while those who already hold assets safely compound their wealth. How does government deficit spending block a first-time homebuyer or a young entrepreneur from getting capital? To fund massive deficits, the Treasury has to flood the open market with bonds. To convince buyers to absorb all that new debt, the government must offer higher yields. This animated diagram illustrates how that yield functions. The Treasury yield, currently hovering around 4.6%, acts as the absolute floor for all other borrowing in the global economy. It is the risk-free baseline. Because the government sets that immovable floor, commercial banks have to charge even more to make a profit. Rates for consumer products like 30-year mortgages and small business loans are physically pushed upward. Borrowing for major life milestones is so expensive right now precisely because the federal government is crowding out the private capital market. The government pays nearly $1 trillion every single year just on interest. So who is on the receiving end of that payout? People often assume the U.S. owes this money to foreign adversaries. But foreign ownership has actually been declining, particularly from countries like China. This demographic chart isolates the $12 trillion in privately held domestic debt. It reveals that the vast majority of these bonds are held by mutual funds, large banks, and the wealthiest Americans. To service this debt, the government relies heavily on income and payroll taxes. These levies disproportionately pull money from the wages of the young, the working, and the middle classes. The Treasury then takes nearly $1 trillion of that gathered tax revenue and pays it straight out as guaranteed interest to those domestic bondholders. It operates as a massive structural wealth transfer. The government taxes the laboring class to subsidize a guaranteed yield for the capital holding class. How did the federal deficit become so structurally imbalanced over the past 30 years? This timeline maps the debt added during every congressional term since 1993. Notice that regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans control the government, the total debt consistently accelerates. You can see exactly where the old baselines shattered. These massive vertical spikes correspond directly with the episodic crisis spending of 2008 and 2020, but the spending never returned to normal. Adding $3 to $4 trillion per congressional term is no longer an emergency measure. It is our permanent, nonpartisan, peacetime reality. In 1946, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio hit a staggering 119%, and the government successfully brought it down. So why can't we just use that post-war playbook to inflate it away today? World War II was an episodic emergency. The borrowing had a definitive end date. Today's deficits are structural, permanently baked into the budget by an aging population drawing on mandatory social programs. Furthermore, we now operate in borderless, highly financialized capital markets. If the central bank tried to artificially cap interest rates today, investors would simply dump their bonds and flee the US dollar. The United States controls its own currency, so it won't face a hard bankruptcy, but it does face a severe inflationary limit, where the sheer cost of servicing the debt completely displaces the funding for discretionary social spending. The national debt is a mathematical engine of immiseration. Until these structural deficits are addressed, the system will continue to subsidize the wealthy by mortgaging the future of the young.